Hello and welcome to the P2I Pivot to Inclusion channel. I am Scott Herbst. I'm the co-owner and chief programming officer of Pivot to Inclusion, here with Dr. Nasiah Cirincione-Ulezi, our CEO and also co-founder. And today we are very thrilled to have Dr. Tony Dunbar as a guest.
Yes.
Tony is the president of AWT2 Consulting. They help organizations authentically discuss and deal with race in their organizations. And here's what I'm really thrilled about personally is, before Tony and I were talking, and he brought up critical race theory and operating from that perspective, and really being pretty new to the world of diversity, equity, inclusion, and all the theory behind it. That's a phrase I've heard a bunch and honestly don't know that much about. So I wanted to take the opportunity to learn from Dr. Dunbar. And anything you want to say before we kick off the interview, Tony?
Well, no, we can get started. A couple of things I guess I do want to say. I want to acknowledge the land that we're on and the indigenous people that had the land before us and that we're fortunate enough to live in our world upon. And that today is the 30th and we only have 2 days left for Women's History Month, because in my course, I do Black History Month. I have something for them every day, and Women's History Month. And one of my partners in racial justice hit me to the term womanist, and I went and got my womanist t-shirt for, so I'm actually in my professor garb versus my corporate garb. So that was my public service announcement, not my P2I, but my PSA.
Right on.
Okay, yeah. What did you call it, Tony? Womanist?
Womanist, like,
A womanist.
Her and I were going back we were talking about the Black feminist thought and back and forth. And she was like, yes. I'm evolving into womanist. She said, I'm not discarding the feminist, but I'm evolving on to womanist. And if your partner, one of your business partners evolving, you don't want to get left behind, right? So okay. I'm upgrading my womanist game.
Okay, because I'm all about the women. Yes, I love it.
So I guess I'm going to start there really broadly. Can you tell us, give us some background on critical race theory? I expect the people who, I don't know much personally, and I expect the much of whom follows our channel probably isn't deeply schooled either. So if you could start there, it'd be awesome.
Makes sense. So I'll deal with things that were like, kind of like the elephant in the room. Again, if we're having a more corporate environment watching this, a lot of what they might have heard is through news and or their own networking around critical race theory, or also called CRT, being villainized a bit during the lead up into the election around the conversation of first, the federal government cut off diversity training. I wouldn't say they villainized it, but they called it racist within itself, that the existence of raising the race consciousness was anti-constitutional, so to speak.
Right.
And part of one of those components they lumped in with that was CRT, or critical race theory. Got a bit of a black eye, so to speak, but it's one of those black eyes you'll take, right? You're effective enough to be on the radar, to be acknowledged. You didn't necessarily want to get sucker punched, but you had to be close enough or raising enough energy to get sucker punched, right? If you're nobody hits somebody super smaller than them, or that's not really can have an impact. But if you're looking somebody eye to eye and they're having an impact, then it was a semi honor to be among the critical race theory community and take that black eye a little bit.
Oh, okay. You just said something that interests me. So there's a whole community behind this, behind critical race theory that I'm unaware of. So I'm here learning too, Tony.
So it will be 40 years old in about 18 months, like 83. So what, 2023 or so?
Okay.
It has a strong legacy, but it it is not as much, it is as much a theory and an activist component of how it was actually generated and created. So if we go back to, say, late 70s, leading into the 80s, there was a group called CLS, Critical Legal Scholars.
Okay.
And they were looking at disparities within the legal system, law professors, practicing attorneys, your AFL-CIO types, intellectuals, but also putting some activism behind them, like almost pre-Brian Stevenson type of thing. They're looking at these disparities. And when they were having their conference, the folks who were of color, primarily Blacks, African Americans, during their critical legal scholar conferences, wanted to start talking about race.
Okay.
And then they had, got a little sidebar group together that started talking about race. And then at some point they decided to declare and make a clear break off and start talking about race and call it critical race theory. And there was a set of scholars, academics, law professors, working professionals, activists within the legal field that kind of launched it. So people started writing about it, releasing books, starting getting inside the scholarly communication of academia in order to put it out there a little bit. So one of the founders of it, and most people use her language and don't even realize it's her, is Kimberly. It's not Kimberly with a Y. It's an accent, LE accent mark. Crenshaw, and she brought in intersectionality. So when you hear people talk about at the intersection of such, and when you know the person, like every time I hear that, I'm like, I see Professor Crenshaw's face. She is a dynamic woman, and I'll circle back to her more as a scholar versus the icon and founder. But there were folks who just wanted to start having those conversations, and your Derek Bales, right? One of Barack Obama's law professors came out with interest convergence. Charles Pierce around microaggressions. So that microaggressions go back to the beginning. It was a term in sociology and in the medical field, as far as more in your area, like behavioral sciences type of thing, and it was brought into academia quite easily. And then it started being pushed out into society. So a lot of those are some of the tools that were with CRT from the beginning. But if you really, really are like an academic junkie type cat, so you would even go past legal scholars, and you can trace it back to the Frankfurt School of the School of Social Science, right? So it can go back pre-World War II.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm just so excited to have you with us because I'm learning a lot as I listen to you. So I'm one of the people back in the 90s who really got into Pan-Africanism and that whole movement. Is there a connection between critical race theory and Pan-Africanism and now what we call kind of the decolonization movement?
I would say they're all under a race consciousness perspective. And then there's some folks who can cross those, I don't necessarily see them as silos, but they can cross fluidly across in that whole area. So for example, while I was in LA at UCLA, I worked for the Pan-African Film Festival, and I got to see that actually unfold, right? The people from around the world in films, and a Pan-African event around both art as well as the film festival itself in LA. As far as the decolonization, I got hip to that through a group called RADLAM, Radical Library and Museum practitioners inside the Allied Media Conference. And they start talking about decolonizing archives or places where histories are held, and mythicizing them, bringing the mythology down. But what I like about the decolonization is that take it one step further, and it reminds me of the early days of critical race theory, where it may not even be that. It reminds me that sometimes something's an abstract concept. So decolonization, you can have a movement, but I mean, we're not going to get decolonized as a nation or as a geographic entity, but we can decolonize our practices. We can decolonize our language. We can decolonize our way of being, even what we do in our writing. If we want to then start taking it a step further, we can do it in our curriculum. Folks are writing curriculums about it. So there's ways to do it. So it may not be a geopolitical move now, and I don't want to underestimate it, but it can definitely be a movement that then has even if you fail at something, but you raise to get the opportunity to challenge it at that level. So I think it has the ability of those who are creating and generating it to be as impactful at the geopolitical level. But right now, they're doing what they're supposed to. They're building community around it. They're teaching classes. They're having Zooms. They're writing curriculums. They're on Twitter sharing. They're identifying themselves. They're bringing folks in. They're introducing the term the same way critical race theorists did. But CRT might have had a higher platform because they were already coming off an established CLS platform. They were already had sort of a strategy of sentencing disparities and all. So they didn't have to necessarily create something. It was already there in their face, and they were already practicing it, albeit not as much along race, but at least they had the class framework to then branch off into the people of color work that they do.
Yes.
Can you help me out a little bit? And so I'm hearing critical race theory, decolonization, Pan-Africanism, and you call them kind of silos, not entirely, but right. And
they're coexisting, but they're not necessarily. I'm not aware of them as under a unique individual term of community, but I think there's folks who visit and are members of those communities and/or tribes.
Okay, and who move between them. Yes.
Some people are comfortable in one and know of the other. There's some people who want to be in all three, 2 out of 3, watch from the sidelines, but like the music they hear that come out of that neighborhood.
Cool. So it's not inconsistent necessarily.
Yeah.
But here's my question is, like if I'm coming from a critical race perspective, right, versus a decolonization perspective, where is my attention in each one? Like, what are the things I'm really focused on? And some of the, I guess, activities or things I'm trying to put into the world, right?
Well, the first thing that you've done off the top is you made a choice. So if you're saying that I'm going to use a primary critical race approach, there's a couple of things that you're definitely going to be doing. You're going to emphatically and consistently be talking about race and those dynamics, be there equities or misappropriate actions. So that's going to definitely be the focal point. And that beyond just the conversation, the intent is for there to be some form of transformation. May it be a little bit of change at a time with some momentum, because change without momentum won't turn into anything of a critical mass. It won't change into transformation.
Yes.
So again, going back to the tenets of it, you're probably taking something from the CRT toolbox, whether you want to talk about microaggressions or have discussions around intersectionality, or whether or not you want to have trainings, a conversation, write a paper. So you have a goal and you're trying to reach a goal. So I would say, from my point of view, I use CRT in that particular manner. If I was then also, let's say I wanted to at least acknowledge in my presentation of whatever I'm doing, whether it be a strategic culture change, or if it's just some intra-cultural trainings I'm doing, I would say that pointing at decolonization is looking for the acknowledgement that we are sitting inside a colonized space, right? That all the dynamics that unfolded historically, be they political, be they economic, came off a colonized framework. So capitalism and all that sits on a colonized framework. So then your education system sits in that. Your social interactions sit on that, inside of a conversation of everything is a response to being colonized and or a counter response to being colonized.
Yeah, so in that, and let me make sure I'm tracking with you. When you say colonize, that really means what it's not like someone's gone in and kind of taken over and pushed their ideas in and like that.
So kind of like that land acknowledgement idea. We sitting on somebody else's spot, right? And
yes.
and the trauma and the genocide that went with it, right? Yes. So decolonization can start there. African Americans talk about being on them ships coming across, right? They were brought to a colonized framework, right? And they were part of the business model to make it work. And then they were subsequently sub-educated inside that same education model. And then they have economic disparities inside that same, the wealth gap. So we sit on that framework. So again, when I was saying it may not change geopolitically, you can still start doing things that changing your curriculum, changing how you address young people of color inside of how they're educated, or what fields they take up, or just even inside the self-image of their intellectual capacity. That and you can frame it as look at things that happen inside of a colonized perspective and be intentional to counter that. Could you marry that with critical race theory? You could, but I would probably want to have that more in an academic context, or I would say they're together and have them as distinct, not to silo them, but for someone who doesn't eat, breathe, and chew on it like I do, so it can be clear, so they can digest it, and give them the opportunity to create their own scaffolding, right? If I connect it too much and they're only repeating what I'm saying, they might see some new scaffolding. And I don't care who they are, right? You put in a business structure, the CPA in there might say, whoa, from our business perspective, our supply diversity and blah, blah, blah. He might see a colonized perspective and a critical race perspective and make some observations I may not make. So there's some thoughtfulness that goes into it. And if I was going to do it, I have not blended the two, but if I was going to do it, I would introduce them distinctly as distinct cousins, part of the family. And then cousin A loves to be known for this, and cousin B, but they get along, kind of.
Tony, excuse me, I want to apologize right now. You are Dr. Dunbar. Let me get present. Dr. Dunbar, you are Dr. Dunbar. I want to, just make everybody aware that we are talking to the doctor, and I believe you have experience with the library and information science.
Right. I was the first person to write present critical race theory in a peer-reviewed journal. And I believe I'm the first one to ever have their dissertation in library and information science being on critical race theory.
Yes. See, y'all, this brother right here has some information. And not only does he have the information, this brother is willing to share it. So thank you, Dr. Dunbar, because I'm sitting here and I'm learning. So I love what you said at the top of the conversation. When you said it falls under consciousness, did I understand you correctly?
You did.
It falls under consciousness, so that Pan-Africanism, and you haven't touched on that yet, and I'm anxiously waiting for you to share your thoughts about Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, critical race theory, and decolonization, they are different, but fall up under that umbrella of consciousness, which to me, all of it is about really addressing your own mindset as it relates to race. Especially when I think about decolonization, I believe you are correct. When I think about decolonization, I'm thinking about how we can, all of us, me included, how we are looking in on ourselves to decolonize our minds.
I would say I agree, obviously, wholeheartedly with that. And consciousness, just in general, is it's probably the counter to segregation, right? So in order for isms and all the things we combat, they're grounded in segregation. But even if people are apart, they can share a consciousness, right? If somebody wants to ally, they can share a consciousness,
yes,
befriend, or even if they want to intentionally separate themselves from it, as in segregation, then they're adopting a different consciousness. And right now, I think the divisiveness that we're seeing in society is the result of intentional consciousness. Like there's folks who want to see. I wouldn't, and again, it's getting a bad rap around socialism and communism, but that just want to see a consciousness of equity. Yeah. And what I'm hearing as the resisting consciousness is that anything that's equitable is now you're taking away the foundation. You know, that's communism, that's socialism, right? No, just act right. You know?
Right.
I ain't even saying like me, just act right when you're around me.
Yes, yes. So I do want you to speak on a little bit as you have information on Pan-Africanism. My understanding of Pan-Africanism, it was a movement. I forget exactly when it started, but I know Stokely Carmichael was one of the individuals who was instrumental in really kind of pushing into the Black community these ideas and the narrative around us as Black people having our own, and even leaving the United States and going to create our own, which I definitely, I see value in that. I see value in communities of color, particularly Black communities, because even in 2021, I see that other BIPOC communities or other communities of color have their own banks, they have their own grocery stores, their own schools. That's not necessarily what we have as people of color, as Black people of color. So I see the value in it. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that, sometimes, I'm getting old, want to make sure that we acknowledge Stokely's changed his name to Kwame Ture.
Yes.
And
yes.
So I want to make sure that I'm authentic in this space. I understand Pan-Africanism more in a less as a consciousness and more as geopolitical, like understanding that whenever you're doing something, it's across the cultures of Africa, right?
Yes.
Right. But anything that I learned or got introduced to, I got from Ayuko Babu, who is the executive director of the Pan-African Film Festival. He started raising my consciousness. I didn't have so he generated a consciousness around it and an awareness. So when I read it, I can come to it from a certain approach about it versus pure academia. Yes. And since it's not what I'm talking about, but understand it, and having him, being able to either get in touch with him or catch him, just like anybody else, have to catch him on a Zoom when he's a panelist, or being around him for the 3.5 years when I was around the Pan-African Film Festival. It gave me, first of all, inside of my conscious, appreciation for the breadth of who we are as Africans, right? I don't know, I could find out, I don't know who I am as an African, but I do appreciate the breadth of the culture, particularly what was brought to the festival, right? Being able to chop it up with folks who were jewelry makers. So you got a brother that's from Los Angeles who has a craft, and he got a booth right next to someone who is from maybe Central or South America, who's part of the diaspora, yes, or might be from somewhere else. So they take over a whole mall, both top and bottom, and it's like a sidewalk sale, and they have booths all the way around, and then they have a fashion show at the end. So just to be in that environment. So what I have is more experiential around that.
Yes.
And that moment, that 2 weeks that the festival is going on, I got to be part of it and experience it. But to say I have the same level of academic and intellectual rigor around it would be disingenuous. But I would say the experience has elevated who I am in all other areas of my consciousness.
That's great. Because we're all about teaching, Dr. Dunbar. When you say the diaspora, I'm not sure everybody understands that. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
So slave trade was global. If a ship was empty and they didn't have slaves in it, it was losing money. So that's why you see folks that look like you and I that speak French, Spanish, Portuguese, and they're in several different continents. So they're spread out. So the African diaspora is the breadth in which folks have have traveled beyond their points of origin. And you can see the slave trade generated diaspora. There's an old Richard Pryor joke. I'm old enough to still know Richard Pryor jokes. And he was like, when he went to Africa and he said, that dude looks like the cat right down the street from me, right? Like, yeah. You know what I'm saying? You can go someplace and see your twin and speaking another language, handling, and like, man, that looks like it. Probably it might be. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because like you, I am born in the United States. My family has been in the United States for several generations now, but I'm very interested, and I'm always curious about our connections to Africa and to African people who are spread all over the world. Really, we are all over the world. And I look for the commonalities, and because there's something about the African culture that is indomitable. And there's that thread in our culture that you can definitely see. I'm in communication with people of African ancestry now on a regular basis. And we are odd. I know people in Dubai, I know people in England, I know people on the continent, various places on the continent of Africa. And there's some commonalities, definitely some differences, but across the globe, there is sort of I call it a unifying vibe amongst the people who originate from Africa.
I would agree. I was trying to find the name of it. Is it Finding Your Roots? Skip Gates' show that's on PBS. I love that show. And like if it's on, I may not watch it regularly, but whenever like it comes on or I'll see a YouTube, I might get distracted and watch the episode and love hearing them talk and watch folks ancestry unfold. He started out with Black folks, but he's broadened it to a breadth of people, and for them to act this and you watch their life unfold, and he turns a page and they meet somebody, they literally meet somebody that was key to their life, 5-6 generations, showing where they existed. I can go back 4 on my mother's side, 5. Wow. And on my father's side, 3. I can go out to a cemetery and look at, I knew my great grandmother. I can go out to a cemetery and see her grave and her parents' grave. So my great. Yeah.
Here and where you're at now, because I can do that, but not in Illinois. Yes. If I'm doing that, I'm going back to Highlandale, Mississippi, and Suggsville, Alabama. That's where my history is. And I don't know if you know this, but years ago in the South, because the cemeteries were segregated, they gave Black folks their own cemetery plots, which was truly a blessing because now we have that history of our dead. So I'm grateful that I'm able to go back and see the graves of my ancestry in those cities in the South.
My folks I'm in Chicago. I was born and raised in Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah, my folks out in Burr Oak. It was that first cemetery that they left, and it was actually it's outside the city limits on the south side. And yes, so My great-grandmother that I knew, my great-grandfather passed before I was there. All my grandfather's siblings and my mother are out there, and one generation beyond my great-grandmother. And I didn't know that till I was old, because I know the area our family's in. So every couple of years I go out and I'll trim around the head. You can't have raised headstones, so I'll trim around the headstone, and I'll do headstones around, even if they're not my family. So I was out a little bit, and I saw the same name, and I'm like, and that's how I discovered. And I went back and talked to my last living aunt at the time. That's how I discovered my great-grandmother's parents. I like, you never told. Usually I would have been mad at my mother, but she's gone. Yeah. Like, you didn't tell me that so-and-so was buried out in Burr Oak with us. And she was like, and then of course, then I get the story like, oh, I thought, like, it was common knowledge. I thought you knew. Your mother didn't tell you, right?
Yeah, that history, that ancestral history is so, so important. It really is.
I got a question. We're just take a slight difference here, but this is something. So you brought Nasiah, you brought it up. In the Pan-Africanism, right? And a movement to have Black schools, Black banks, etc. That's something that can really trigger white people, right? And so I'm wondering if we could move the conversation there and just around why that's important.
Okay, I'm certainly willing to speak on that. Kind of beyond, because I'm like Dr. Dunbar. I am not a scholar of Pan-Africanism, but I can share my thoughts and perspectives on the importance of Black people having their own. But I'm interested to hear our guest first.
Well, you started the question in the right context, Scott. All three of us are doctors, so it's not necessary to put mine out there. Tony is fine, but I respect. I'm in your house, so it's however you want to do it. But Scott brought up a triggering. That triggering isn't new. So that triggering happened all during slavery, but it started getting hyper quick and hyper intense during Reconstruction, because there were Black senators and congressmen. There were folks who were elected federal and state officials. In fact, the Black vote is what got Grant to be president, and during then, that's when the power was understood and the resentment started to build then. And that's when a negotiation, I forget which president, there was a negotiation around that election, because we weren't elections were a little bit more narrow, right? They were the Congress kind of selecting and so forth. So in that, there was a compromise that pushed Black and disenfranchised Black folks, not only from what they were elected, but from even participating in voting. Again, they didn't erase the amendment, but what they did was just, after Reconstruction, all the disenfranchisement, violent disenfranchisement moves that were done from there. So that triggering it has a legacy all within itself. So if we lily pad on and bring that to today, we go back to consciousness, right? There's a certain consciousness of, if you aren't astute to see what's, so for example, you and I were talking, based on how you were raised, you can see things in a certain manner because you've got an opportunity. You have a broader vantage point range to see stuff. But if what you were raised to see is only this, and in this lane there's a certain separation, segregation, subordination of folks of color, or at least not associating with them, that even to that level of segregation, if that's your only view, then you're going to get triggered by that a little quicker than someone who has this point of view, or at least been able to see this, or has a consciousness that can take in this much. I'm not sure if I've really gotten to the economic part of your question, but hopefully I at least started the conversation.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you, Dr. Dunbar. Let me just share and offer this. You know, again, my roots are in the South, the Southern USA, Hollandale, Mississippi, and Suggsville, Alabama. So my parents grew up in the segregated Jim Crow South. What I learned from my parents, from my grandparents, and even now, my own lived experience, there is an incredible strength that when Black people come together can be perceived as threatening. Community equals strength. You know, what you can't do alone, you can do in community. And what the Jim Crow South served to do is keep people separate, keep people in fear. So there has always been, especially coming out of the Southern US, this fear of Black people being in community, having their own, becoming less dependent on structures that have traditionally been very, very supremacist in nature and served to keep, served as oppression agents for people. So I think that mindset is carried on, which is why it's so triggering, because it has been identified as a threat. I will tell you, and I don't know about you, Dr. Dunbar, but I remember an unspoken rule, especially as it relates to work and a school, is, you know, too many of us talking together, we shouldn't do it because it really serves white folks get nervous and suspicious when they see too many Black people congregating together. Truly, this was a thing that has been talked about amongst my colleagues of color, specifically Black. So I think from my lens and my lived experience, that triggering is a result of perceiving Black people in community as a threat. A threat to what? A threat to white power, potentially.
I think my view. You nailed it on the head. I don't necessarily think it would be articulated back to you of those who are threatened. But I think when I went back to the Reconstruction period, I also wanted to go back to when I was more direct to Scott's question is, Black Tulsa, Black Wall Street. I mean, we had resources. There are folks who, for years, Rosewood, any number of communities, the folks that were in Harlem, how many different folks had built things up and had to take them in, and they start again of both legal and illegal means. So that and the terror and I can't speak to the consciousness. I've seen it and I have an understanding of it, but I can't speak to that level of divisiveness. Now, I granted some of it stoked, right? In order, if I can stay on top and I can get you and Nasiah, like say, I want a piece of your business and I'm talking to you about it, and I go over and whisper to her, and I whisper to you, I create some divisiveness. That's one of the ways that where I can get what I want and maybe get ahead of you a little bit, right? And that mentality has been soaked into our consciousness. And I think it's been, I wouldn't even say reawakened, but invigorated based on some of the discourse and pre-2016, it was getting reinvigorated 2008 on that election, right? But it was low key. And then 10 years later, it didn't have to be low key anymore. It could be full throated out front, you know, with some tiki torches. Right. So, and before then, I mean, it comes up in different format, but that triggering, if we're going to make it a little bit more benign, is just the ultimate resistance to equity. We don't want it to be, we don't want equity. We don't want things to be, we don't mind equal, because at equal, if they move up 6, we move up 6. Equity starts making it look like this. But if you out a mile ahead and you get 9 nickels every time I get 9 nickels, I'm still not going to ever be seeing you, but maybe the back of your footprint as you leaving me in the dust.
Yeah. Yes. Let me ask you this, because I think when we start getting into equity, justice, and that's where I try to keep my alignment, even more so than diversity, because I think if you stay justice and equity aligned, then that diversity will come. What I'm finding, what I'm experiencing is a resistance to looking inward. Now, I'm one of the people that read Robin DiAngelo's book, and I know there were a lot of criticisms about the book. She is the lady, okay, you have it. She wrote White Fragility, and people criticized it. But she, and I don't know who else has been able to capture it in academia, but she captured something that I thought was very powerful when she talked about that good-bad binary and how it is incredibly difficult for our educated, well-educated, very liberal and progressive white folks to see how they really maintain systemic racism. So I'm finding that piece, people looking inward, is serving as an incredible barrier to justice and equity. People are willing to get uncomfortable until they have to look at themselves and get really uncomfortable.
Yeah. If we could turn the conversation that way, because we really have a few minutes left now, but I think that's a really great place to jump off to, which I want to ask next, which is how do you, because what you're talking about is, I think it takes a particular willingness, it takes a particular vulnerability. You got to confront stuff about yourself, right? And so like to do that, it's like Tony, what you said earlier, authenticity, right? So I'm curious, in the world of an organization, how do you create space where people are able, willing, etc., to do that in an environment that I don't think naturally calls for it,
There's 2 or 3 approaches. I think there's only one that really works, but it often gets watered down because the uncomfortability level kicks up quickly. Smoke, fumes, the whole thing. It's palpable, right? And when it's palpable, then the environment becomes not only toxic but maybe even dangerous. So one of the things that off the top is they're not a talk-in, but a complete buy-in from leadership. So if we're talking about an organization that's trying to bring that in, it has to be the theatrics and the components of transformation. It can't be theatrics versus transformation, which is most of the time what it is. It's a lot more show. So whether it needs to be bought in at the board level, the administrative C-suite administration level, but it has to be intentional, thoughtful, and intentional. And if it's not done that, and a lot of times even they, in taking it on, aren't aware to the level in which they're going to have to be committed to it. Sometimes they want to be conveniently committed, but for it to actually be effectual, be more than a branding or a temporary feel-good story that you can put out, and we did this, and it turned back on a survey said this. And we have so many ERGs, right? And ERGs of color. That's window dressing, right? And you have to see your organization internally, and that once it becomes outward facing, and those people are they're out in society as well. So if you're not really intentional about it, And usually by the time it takes to get intensely intentional about it, and sometimes this is legit, resources dry up, we can only put so much, we've now had the pandemic and we had the Great Recession in less than a generation apart. So it can be legitimized around that, but those folks don't really understand the value they can get out of it and elevate. It's not a sacrifice. And when they take it on as sacrifice, like I'm doing something versus an elevation, like to really intentionally do it as part of an elevation, then you can see it a little different. You can approach it a little differently, and you can wish well those folks who don't want to be part of that culture. And that's uncomfortable. People will leave. Well, yeah, some people are going to leave just the fact that you're having this conversation, at this level. Yeah. And so, yes, at every level in which you're going, but other people will show up.
Yeah.
Other people will show up. And again, you have to, it's a courage component, right? And I tell folks all the time, I'm very straight up about it because I'm old now. I'm intentional about making you uncomfortable. I come in, I'm not trying to hide it. I'm not trying to shake you up or, accost you, but I know the nuances of comfort zones, and I don't like ease up to it. Like if this is what we're talking about, I walk right up to your comfort zone line. Like, how you doing? And my feet are right on the line. Like the toes of my shoes are on your comfort line. There's no need to play around. If that's too close and you're uncomfortable there, I probably can't help you. There's no sense in wasting both our times.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. So in your experience, how willing are the people you work with? How willing are they to go there, to go to that uncomfortable line?
I think there's twofold. There's some that are ready, but don't still, and it's hard to predict, a culture is made up of components. You can't say it's almost the physics of humanity, how it's going to change and move around. But there are some folks who are at a point that I'll just use a continuum just as a visual. They might be at a 3 of being committed, but they're growing.
Yeah.
And they have potential and you want to stay with them. There's others that never really wanted to go beyond a 3, and being at a 3 is about as far as they can go. And they are working at their capacity. And so that's a relationship builder between them and their racial justice or their culture consultants. At the high level, I try to be as straight up as possible.
Yeah.
And because I'm not trying to live off of that, right? I'm not trying to have 25 engagements. If 25 engagements comes out of it, great. I'd rather tell you straight up. And I can tell, I've been around long enough, I can tell by the responses I get, and or what's not said where you're at. Even if you're trying not to tell me, you tell me by what you don't tell me. Because if I didn't hear it, I'm like, they didn't mention that. And they thinking, oh, he didn't ask about it. So he must, I'm like, no need him. And so I'm not trying, some consultants can work with you and they're authentically trying to move you along. Others are trying to get 5 more engagements, 2 more years of engagement, so that they'll let you take as long as you want. I don't live off of that necessarily. And so I'm more straight up and to the point about it. I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings, but if you talk to me and we have a couple of meetings about it and whether or not to engage, I don't think you're naive about what approach I'm thinking about, or you're definitely less naive about what's real.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things that Scott and I got real clear on early on, and I'm glad we aligned, is that we won't be able to work with everybody, and that doing this work, we are committed to exclusively working with people who want to bring us on long-term, because it's long-term, it's ongoing, and it can't be done in one consultation or two or three. It is a long-term commitment to put processes in place that will help organizations continue to do the work. And I like what you said. It yields great benefits. It yields great benefits, but you have to put the work in. Be willing to put it in.
I would agree. I would agree. It's an elevator, and it can be an elevator in spite of resistance. So those that want to stay but don't want to change might sabotage it. So if they can pull it down, right? That's part of the culture. They can pull it down. Even if the leadership is saying this, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything assertive, but by not doing this, I make it heavier, right? I mean, now it's a little more weighted. And all those are realistic dynamics, and it takes a full commitment to it, and not just a commitment, like you can be committed, you ain't put no resources, you just mildly, your commitment level is mildly interested, but you got to put some resources around it, time, effort, finances. It has to be part of the business plan. Yeah. Right. And the culture is part of the business plan. And if none of that is integrated fully, right, then you get diminishing returns based on how little it is integrated into it. If you want to taste lemonade, something in your baked goods, but you didn't put any lemon extract in it, it ain't gonna taste lemonade.
I like that analogy. I've never heard it before. Thank you, Dr. Dunbar.
We are at about time here. Before we complete, Dr. Dunbar, is there anything that you wanted to say to our audience that we haven't touched on yet?
No, I just enjoyed the conversation. You give a loquacious brother a mic, and he can run.
Yeah, I feel like
run with it forever.
Yeah, I feel like this every time we have a conversation with someone, is that we've got our time and we could go for like another hour and a half, right? Yeah. There's just so much to explore. Yes. Well, so with that said, thank you again for being here. Again, our guest today was Dr. Tony Dunbar of AWD D2 Consulting, and saying goodbye. This has been Pivot to Inclusion's channel, here with our CEO, Dr. Nasiah Cirincione-Ulezi. I am Scott Herbst, and we will see you next time. Yes.